We begin, though, this morning with President Donald Trump, who was sworn in as commander-in-chief exactly 1 month ago. Over the weekend, the president held a campaign-style rally in Florida. He assured the audience of thousands that his White House is running smoothly, despite reports to the contrary. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump is still searching for a new national security advisor and preparing to unveil a new immigration order. It all comes as a new Gallup poll shows that 41% of Americans approve of President Trump's job performance thus far. 55% disapprove. Our Major Garrett is at the White House with a look at how the president plans to kick off his second month in office.
The White House is running so smoothly.
President Trump found shelter in a fawning political rally in Florida this weekend, denying disorganization and disarray in the White House.
I'm here because I want to be among my friends.
But the president still does not have a national security advisor. That after Mr. Trump's first national security advisor, retired General Michael Flynn, was forced to resign last week for misleading White House officials about his conversations with the Russian ambassador. Trump met with 4 possible replacements Sunday, including former UN Ambassador John Bolton and Keith Kellogg, the acting national security advisor. Retired Admiral Robert Harward last week rejected an offer to replace Flynn, in large part because the White House would not allow him to appoint his own staff.
The issue with Admiral Harward never came up.
White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus said the new national security advisor will have a free hand.
The NSA director can do whatever he or she wants to do with the NSC and the makeup of the NSC.
I also want to speak to you without the filter of the fake news.
President Trump's sharp criticism of skeptical news coverage continued. In one tweet, he called leading news organizations the enemy of the American people.
I think you should take it seriously.
On Face the Nation, Priebus said the president is right to attack the press.
It's total garbage. So we spend, 48 hours on bogus stories, and the American people suffer. So I do think it's a problem.
Arizona Republican John McCain, a frequent critic of Mr. Trump, said the president's language crossed a line.
I'm afraid that we would lose so much of our individual liberties over time. That's how dictators get started.
Our Major Garrett joins me now from the White House. And Major, I want to get to the president's attacks on the press in just a moment. But first, I want to start with the search for a new national security advisor. Everybody talking about this today because we know Mr. Trump did meet with candidates in Florida over the weekend. What more can you talk about here?
Well, John Bolton is a real contender for this job, I am told by those close to the process. He is someone who has been on the list of possible Trump advisors for a good long time, dating all the way back to the transition when he was, for a time, considered a possible deputy secretary of state. Dropped out of that category, and he reemerged with the Flynn dismissal last week. He interviewed with the president this week at Mar-a-Lago, the Winter White House, as did the acting national security advisor Keith Kellogg, Henry McMaster, a military strategist, and Robert Caslen, who is the current superintendent of the Army Military Academy at West Point. All 4 of those met with the president or will meet with the president. Keith Kellogg's in the building right now as the acting national security advisor, and that mere presence has to give him an edge, because he's carrying out to the best of his abilities with limited authority the job of a national security advisor right now. And he was part of the Trump campaign as a military and national security advisor, part of the transition. Not the most dynamic personality, I think, even by his own admission, and there are those in the White House who think someone who should fill the national security advisor post needs to have a much stronger, more forceful personality, but they may not be able to find someone willing to take the job under the conditions the White House has put forward. So Keith Kellogg, occupying that place now as acting national security advisor, may have an edge. But John Bolton is a serious contender as well, and the president hopes to make an appointment here within the week.
Interesting spot for Kellogg to be in. Do we think these are the final 4, or could this search expand even more?
The search could expand. It all depends on what the president wants and who's willing to join this team. I will tell you, there are those who've been on the outside who might want to do this job, thought about maybe putting themselves in a position to be thought of for this job, who are more than a little bit alarmed by the president's press conference in the East Room on Thursday and have sort of dialed back a little bit. So when you build a team, you have to have people who want to be on your team, comfortable with the commander-in-chief, comfortable with those in the White House, and the president, commander-in-chief, and those around him have to be comfortable with the person you bring in. They thought they had that with Robert Harward, the vice admiral, but they simply could not get over, in large measure, this disagreement over personnel within the National Security Council staff. That's also rattled people who may want to be considered for this job or who thought maybe it was a job worth having. They're not so sure anymore.
Major, I want to talk about something else that happened over the weekend, that rally in Florida on Saturday specifically, where the president spoke about a revised version of his executive order on immigration. I know you've been doing a lot of reporting on the content of that order. What are you learning about today?
Well, the president was actually very clear about this on Thursday at his East Room press conference when he said it will be written in accordance with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision to uphold a current blanket temporary restraining order on the first executive order. So the president can do all the criticism he wants, and he's done plenty of it, about that judicial order from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And yet, as he criticizes that decision, his White House counsel, Don McGahn, is writing an executive order that conforms with the legal criticism of the first one, meaning clarifying in that executive order that if you're a legal permanent resident, LPR is another way to describe it, or green card holder, all the same thing, you are exempted from the temporary travel ban covering those 7 predominantly Muslim countries in that first executive order. Also, if you're in transit to the country at the time the new executive order is signed, you'll be allowed to enter the country under the existing screening procedures, not the new ones with so-called extreme vetting. So the executive order that the president will put forward this week will try to shore up some of the problems that existed with the first one, which he said was legally unquestionable. Well, it was not legally unquestionable. A temporary restraining order prevents it from being used right now. And the president wants to get rid of that impediment legally and put together a new executive order, which I will tell you, Jamie, has been the advice of his political allies for the better part of 2.5 weeks. Just forget this court battle over the first one. Take a mulligan on it, if you want to use a golf term, which the president would certainly be familiar with. Write a new executive order and get the policy you want in place and make it legally defensible and, from the perspective of Republicans, politically advantageous.
Yeah, it seems like scrapping the first one and moving on would be the best route to go for him. I do want to ask you about that tweet the president sent out over the weekend calling certain news outlets the enemy of the American people. It's something Defense Secretary James Mattis was asked about on Saturday during a trip through the Middle East. I want to play a little bit for you what Secretary Mattis had to say and then get you to weigh in on the other side.
I've had some rather contentious times with the press, but no, the press, as far as I'm concerned, are a constituency that we deal with, and I don't have any issues with the press myself.
Different perspective from that of what we heard in your story just a short time ago from Reince Priebus. What are the potential implications here of this kind of disconnect? It's not only this, but there are other issues where there seems to be a real disconnect between the president and his people.
Well, the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, is spending a good deal of time at the security conference in Munich trying to reassure American allies in Europe about what America intends to do under a Trump presidency. He did, in one breath, last week say, listen, the president means what he says about each and every NATO country fulfilling its obligations under the NATO Charter to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. We do mean that. And we're not going to pull out of NATO, but we do mean you've got to do your fair share, because the United States and the American taxpayers are no longer going to fulfill NATO obligations on your behalf if you're not willing to do them yourselves. So on that level, Defense Secretary Mattis was echoing the president completely, but also trying to reassure them about the general sense that America under President Trump is not going to completely disengage from Europe or from the world or become an isolationist pseudo-empire all on its own. It will remain engaged, but it's going to demand things of European countries that previous presidents have not demanded. On the question of the press corps, General Mattis is as good as anyone in the administration, having a long-standing relationship, sometimes adversarial, with those in the media. And he's probably trying to send a signal to the president, look, this is not a war or an adversary worth constantly either picking on or trying to create a false conflict with. There is a natural adversarial relationship between any press corps and any sitting president. Yes, this particular president has amplified that adversarial relationship, and his rhetoric is of the kind none of us have seen before. And as someone who works under the protection of the First Amendment, that's his rhetoric. I'm here. The facts are the facts, and we'll carry on.
Yes, as you do, Major. We appreciate that, too. Real quickly before you go, something that popped this morning. We're learning about that senior administration official on the National Security Council who was fired last week following a private speech in which he was critical of some of the president's policies. What can you tell us about this?
His name is Craig Deere. He was appointed by President Trump. He's not on Obama administration holdover, appointed by the president to lead the National Security Council's Western Hemisphere desk, which is essentially the person at the top of that pyramid of National Security Council staff and those who deal with the other various relevant federal agencies about all policy dealing with the Western Hemisphere. And Craig Deere, at a private event, said something that was critical of the president in that he believed the early actions of President Trump had damaged relationships with Mexico in the Western Hemisphere, part of his area of expertise. It got back to the president, and he fired him for insubordination. And as those I've talked to about this situation are willing to admit, insubordination has a rather broad definition within this White House. One other thing to note, Jamie, Craig Deere was the 7th person last week escorted off of White House property.
Oh, my.
7 people fired. The other 6 were escorted off the property and premises because they failed their FBI background check. 7 people in this administration, hired by the president, working in this White House or in the old executive office building, the Eisenhower executive office building just in front of me, escorted off the premises. So when the president says everything is running smoothly, fine. But 7 people you appointed, you hired, had to be escorted off the premises because either they were insubordinate or they couldn't pass a background check. Maybe that's fine-tuning. Maybe that's a machine that's running as a fine-tuned machine. Maybe everything is fine. Maybe everything is great. But people are walking out of this building, and they're not doing so happily, and they usually have guards with them.
Very good point, Major Garrett, for us at the White House. We so appreciate the time and the facts.
Thanks.